Once upon a time, there was Gardiners, the men's clothing store on the corner of Commercial Road and Whitechapel High Street, 2 miles to the east. Straight down the Whitechapel Road and towards the end of Mile End Road, there was, once upon a time, the La Boheme Cinema and Ballrooms on the corner of Burdett Road, facing Grove Road. And, once upon a time, before the Nazis in the 1940s began to blitz London, the East End was home to some 100,000 Jews between the La Boheme and Gardiners. Today, the guide on an East End tour here on the corner of Whitechapel Road and Fieldgate Street would tell his visitors that perhaps there could be just 7,000 Jews living in the area. That's all. Has the Jewish East End then gone forever? For Baron Moss, the La Boheme was his home. He lived there. Until recently, he was the chairman of a West End advertising agency. He is also the author of a number of books, one which includes some childhood memories.
Everybody in the East End remembers the La Boheme. We had some pretty posh wedding receptions in the ballrooms my father built. They used to come in fancy gowns. Daimlers would queue outside. And I suppose to the ordinary non-Jewish East Ender, every one of us must have seemed like a millionaire. When I got caught in the crossfire, I went to Cooper's School just off Tredegar Square. There were over 600 boys in the school. My dad didn't charge a penny, but he arranged for the whole of Cooper's to see films like The House of Rothschild, or the one about the Duke of Wellington, The Iron Duke, the good old George Arliss films. Good for their education, my dad said. Education? That's a laugh. In those days, we got our education on the streets. Half of my class wore black shirt badges, and the other half wore hammer and sickle badges. My bedroom overlooked some of those little streets behind the La Boheme by the Mile End Arena. The fascists used to meet there, banging their drums and shouting, "The Yids, the Yids, we got to get rid of the Yids." Then, just for the fun of it, they'd smash a few shop windows in the Mile End Road. I used to get some rough handling here too. When I upset my Cheder master, Mr. Libet, he'd grab hold of my cheeks, lift me up from the desk and slap my face as I crashed to the floor. My father was instrumental in financing the shul and the Hebrew classes, so I got no sympathy from him. Just another wallop for upsetting Mr. Libet. Yes, it's worth remembering what my parents did. A lot of good has come out of that community in Bow. But so many things have changed, so many. Harley Street Shul is now a Sikh temple. But you know, some things haven't changed that much. If you ask me, the Asian community there have the same old problems that I had when I was a kid.
Close to the corner of the Mile End Road and Burdett Road, a restaurant still carries the name La Boheme. But as Baron Moss said, many things have changed, many, many things. Only a few 100 yards along from the La Boheme in the Mile End Road, towering above the trees, the clock tower of the original People's Palace still stands. It was just over 100 years ago that Queen Victoria, in her Jubilee year, came through Whitechapel. She was on her way through streets lined with her cheering subjects, passing the London Hospital, to lay the foundation stone for the new technical schools in the grounds of the new People's Palace, and to declare open the magnificent Queen's Hall. As the Illustrated London News put it, the event would bear witness by the royal family to the social improvement of the London working class in the greatest of cities, the social, commercial and political centre of the greatest imperial union that has ever existed in the world.
My first involvement with the People's Palace goes back now some 70 years. We lived in the Mile End Road, just off Tredegar Square. I'm sitting beside my mother with my sisters Bertha, Bella, Rachel and Esther, my elder brother Alfred, and of course my father. It was during the First World War, in 1917, I went to the People's Palace to take my 11 plus exam. I was then a pupil at Malmesbury Road School and won a scholarship to Cowper's, not Cooper's. The East London College was here long before the Queen Mary College of today, and my first year of dental studies was at East London. 20 years later, I was again active at the Malmesbury Road School. The Old Fort Hebrew classes met there. I was the honorary secretary, and to raise funds for our classes, we used the People's Palace. It was quite an occasion. We had the singer Lena Horne and that famous music hall artist Harry Champion.
In 1936, a new People's Palace was built alongside the old. Jewish organizations used it extensively for concerts and political rallies, and many a marriage was arranged at the regular ballroom dances held there. It was East End's foremost cultural center. Here the world-famous artists would perform, even during the worst days of the Blitz. Today, it is no longer the People's Palace. The name has been removed. A complex of buildings have mushroomed along the Mile End Road, the Queen Mary College of the University of London. If you live nearby, don't let the London Hospital sign confuse you. Soon you will see that the London is still in the Whitechapel Road. This sign is guiding you to the hospital still located beside the library. You possibly knew it as the Mile End or Bancroft, but now it is dwarfed beneath the overhanging skyscrapers of Queen Mary College. The Asian languages on the hospital board reflect the community changes over the past 15 years. For as we return into the Mile End Road of 1977, the Albert Stern House of Queen Mary College, the tall building on the right, was the Bet Cholim, the old age home of the Spanish and Portuguese Sephardi community. This building was erected in 1912. Close by lies Anglo-Jewry's first cemetery, dating back to 1656. But I wonder how many of us knew that nearly 200 years ago, when there were about 17,000 Jews in London, this impressive institution stood in the Mile End Road opposite the first Sephardi old age home. This was the original Jewish orphanage, the Neve Tzedek, the Jews' hospital for the aged poor, and the education and employment of youth. Some 50 years later, Ashkenazi philanthropists erected in South London a new magnificent hospital. This became the well-known Jewish orphanage at Norwood. Today, looking past St. Mary's College and the old Sephardi home towards Whitechapel, can you remember what was on the opposite side of the Mile End Road, now with gardens and high-rise flats? Before the Blitz, here stood the Colosseum and Palladium cinemas. But the Palladium did not only show films. At High Holy Days, the cinema became a house of prayer. The additional services at the La Boheme and the Imperial Ballrooms in Cottage Grove could not cope with the then ever-growing local Jewish population. And today, it is here that a remnant of that vigorous East End Jewry is still struggling to survive.
I first became involved with the Stepney Bernabrid settlement in the 1930s. The Stepney Mile End area offered little for girls after school hours. So the first Women's Lodge helped to bring the Stepney Girls Club into being. And this is when I went down to help Phyllis Gerson as a club manager. Life today may not have the same back-breaking grind of the 30s, but the work began here in 1929 by Phyllis is needed more than ever. Phyllis was really an amazing personality. She transformed so many confused, bewildered young girls into people with a purpose in life. During the war, here she ran a hostel for bombed-out youngsters. She organised a nursery, an emergency school, and even led the first Jewish relief unit to Egypt and Italy. Over 35 years ago, the Queen Mother, Queen Elizabeth, visited the settlement. Chatting to Phyllis was not something new for her. For some years earlier, Phyllis had been honoured with the MBE. We're home to hundreds of people, and the disabled, by the way, are brought in by ambulance to enjoy a day in company, for loneliness is frightening. This is one of the areas where we work closely with the Jewish Welfare Board. We even have our own shop, for it's not so easy to get a jar of rain if you live in a high-rise flat in Bow. We have 3 separate friendship clubs. For our club leaders, planning programs around the year is no easy task. We're constantly on the lookout for good entertainers, and we try to get top-rate performers. But we have a major job of work to do for these isolated old folk unable to get to our centre. So we have to go to them. Trudy Sharma, bless her, helped to bring into being our kosher Meals on Wheels service. The very first, mark you, nearly 30 years ago.
The arrival of our volunteers is often their only regular contact with the community. They're not just lifesavers on the food front. A kosher meal to them means they're still part of the Jewish family. We're proud to feel that in the 1960s, the Mayor of Jerusalem, Teddy Kollek, came to us to see our work before the Jerusalem Lifeline organization began their mill service.
I grew up not far from those tenements. God help us if we forget our roots, the people who still struggle in the East End to live a dignified life. Yes, we're still here. Some might say just about. But you can help us make sure we're more than just a memory. If the Queen Mum can back us up, surely we can all do our bit to help.
We're on our way now to Wickhams and the Mile End Waste. The number 25 bus is blocking our view of the Mile End public baths. Now just a tattered memory of the days when, for 3 pennies, you could have a second-class bath with a thin linen towel. First class cost 6pence. For that you got an extra large terry towel. That was real luxury. The majestic tower of the old Wickhams Department Store still rides high above what was once the Harrods equivalent of East London. And the name of the cinema, Coronet, will fall strangely on the ears of those who knew it as the Mile End Empire. Some East End veterans would have called it the Paragon, for back in the good old days of music hall, great stars like Vesta Tilley would top the variety bill there.
When I was a kid, they used it for Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur services as well. But Wickhams, oh Wickhams, what a fantastic place that was for us children. We loved to ride up and down on the lifts. The attendants didn't mind as long as we were good. Nearly everybody belonged to Wickhams clubs. You just pay 6pence or something a week, and then you'd buy what you wanted. I even bought my trousseau this way. Spiegelhalther. There's a story for you. Long before Wickhams built their massive store, Spiegelhalters had their shop on the Mile End Road. Wickhams wanted to buy them out. Spiegelhalther said, "Not on your Nelly." So Wickhams built their store around them. They were sure they would sell, but they were wrong. It was Wickhams that closed down. Spiegelhalter stayed in business.
Today, the Carmel food store separates the building that never came together. Spiegelhalters were not Jewish. They came to England well over 200 years ago. They were Moravian Christians from Germany. This unusually clear stretch of the Mile End Road seems to be a natural backcloth for a 1938 May Day rally with Dan Frankel, the local Labour MP, leading the march. And it was about here, back in the 18th century, that the explorer Captain James Cook lived for some time in the Mile End Road. And also here in the Mile End Waste, William Booth brought into being the Salvation Army, battling against the wretched poverty and shocking living conditions in the East End. But it was another Booth, Charles Booth, a noted social reformer, who in his book Life and Labour in London, published in 1900, who wrote, "The whole district has been affected by the increase of the Jewish population. It has been like the slow rising of a flood. Street after street is occupied. No Gentile could live in the same house with these poor foreign Jews, and even as neighbours, they are unpleasant." Some 10 years ago, a new statue to General William Booth was dedicated, but there is nothing today to remind us that next door to the Tower Hamlets mission was the Great Assembly Hall. It was built in 1886 by Frederick Charrington. His father owned the Mile End Brewery, which is still the largest business in Stepney. From this gigantic hall, it could hold over 5,000, young Charrington battled against his own father, denouncing the evils of drink. But for the Jewish community, every one of those 5,000 seats would be taken to hear the great Chazan Sorota give a cantorial concert. From the great synagogue in Duke's Place, the first Lord Rothschild, on Yom Kippur, would walk along the Whitechapel Road to the Great Assembly Hall to read the Book of Jonah in English at the afternoon service. It was from this hall in 1898 Theodor Herzl, the founder of political Zionism, appealed for support for his cause. And it was from here in 1917 the tailors of Whitechapel responded to Jabotinsky's call to join the Jewish Legion to regain Palestine from the Turks. Jabotinsky, in his farewell speech to his tailors 30 years before the State of Israel was established, declared, "You will one day read glorious news of a free Jewish life in a free Jewish country. Then you shall stand up, walk to the mirror, look yourself proudly in the face, jump to attention and salute yourself, for 'tis you who have made it." You may find it difficult to believe that at this part of the Mile End Road you have this country-like setting, and as you walk down the path to the clock tower of the chapel, you will be equally surprised that in the Golden Triangle the name of God is engraved in Hebrew. It was in 1696 that the Trinity Alms Houses were built for sailors. Mile End Gate. Yes, once upon a time there was a toll gate at the crossroads where the Mile End Road met the Whitechapel Road. At 175, the Great Eastern Coffee Pot. The Eel Pie House at 176, with the Morton Pub on the corner of Cambridge Heath Road. It will not surprise you to hear that they no longer exist, but the blind beggar is certainly there. Before the war, Abraham Vennet was the publican. Mile End and Stepney are behind us now as we enter the Whitechapel Road. Founded by Maurice Meyer in 1913, a few doors from the blind beggar survived through 2 world wars, finally to close in 1950. It was a daily Yiddish newspaper, and I know it was from the bilingual advertisements my father first learned to master printed words in English.
Let me tell you, though, that there was one man in Whitechapel who wouldn't compromise his Yiddish. Abraham Stenzel. He was a purist. From his East End base, he slaved until he died in 1983 to keep Yinglish out of Yiddish. He knew English well, but in his later years, Yiddish was his only language. You would see him at Jewish gatherings, selling his monthly Loschen and Leben. Financially, how he managed, I just can't fathom out. But without doubt, if the East End has any claim to Yiddish literature, real Yiddish, then for me it was Stenzel, and Stenzel alone.
Brady Street was where Lionel Baker was born. Robert Montefiore in Davenant, his schools. Career, accountant to international clients.
If you're telling me that's where Brady Street meets Whitechapel Road, then I don't recognise it. UK International C21? But that's where it owns, the Pan people. And that's better. Yes, that's it. The Yiddish and Zeit offices are just off the picture on the extreme right. Yes, that's the Brady buildings. The skyscraper, though, wasn't there in my day. 6 of us in the family. 1 living room, 1 bedroom, and luxury of luxuries. We had the lavatory in the apartment. Robert Montefiore and Davenant were my schools, yes, but my real education, or better still, if I've had any success in life, it's from Brady, the Brady Club of the 30s. My real teachers were the managers, Sam Ansell, people like Sidney Drage, whom I've always considered to be my mentor, who came down from university, who tactfully brought their world into our poor surroundings. Camp at the Isle of Wight, at Bembridge. Very few of us could afford it. We were assessed according to our parents' income. Ability to pay was the only criteria, but to the best of my recollection, no boy was ever stopped from going to camp simply because he couldn't pay. You're heading for Gardiners? Go past Brady Street, past the London Hospital, and then straight down. You can't miss it.
Long before Gardiners was ever heard of, the London Hospital has probably been the most well-known landmark in the area. And with the Whitechapel station immediately opposite, this stretch of the Whitechapel Road with its famous market stores and shops has always been the Piccadilly Circus of East London. The shopkeepers of days gone by have all moved away, although 1 or 2 familiar names still remain. And on this pavement, said to be one of the widest in London, Jewish boy met Jewish girl. The monkey parade, we called it. But before 1939, for a Jewish boy or girl to get into that hospital to become a doctor, well, that was another matter.
I suppose I was one of the lucky ones. For one of us to get into the London Hospital Medical School had nothing to do with your qualifications. The hospital just wasn't keen to have Jewish doctors at any level. Of course, before the war, there was a high proportion of Jewish patients. There was a Rothschild ward, but few doctors and certainly no consultants. Today, Jewish patients are rare. Things have certainly changed. They have a good number of top Jewish consultants and specialists. I wonder how many Jewish students there are today in the London Hospital Medical College.
Many changes have taken place at the London. The length of pavement now with the red and white tint and the large extension with the fire escape 10 years ago looked like this. Even by then, many of the shopkeepers like Sporter Gowns, Huberman, the egg and batter importers, and Abrahams, the cigar manufacturers, had gone. So had Johnny Isaacs. In the good old days, the East End's #1 fish and chip shop used to be nearly opposite Wickhams. Naroditsky, the printer, was his neighbour, before they moved to Bedford Street, Cavell Street. In those days, at least the newspaper holding your piping hot chips and succulent wally, the ink, somehow or other, never came off on your hands. We're looking down the Whitechapel Road from the crossroads just beyond the London Hospital. Davis, the gents' outfitter, is on the corner of New Road, and on the opposite corner is Valence Road with the chemist shop. For over 70 years, there's been a chemist on this corner. Many of you will remember Liff from before the war, and many of you will also remember the anti-Nazi campaigns which proved useless in the Chamberlain years of appeasement. In Valence Road, a catastrophic price was paid. Here at Hughes Mansions, the last V-2 rocket of the war fell on the 27th of March, 1945. At 20 minutes past 7 in the morning, 130 people were killed. 120 were Jews. Complete families were wiped out. One where only the grandfather survived to bury 2 sons, 2 daughters, a daughter-in-law, and a grandson. One of the sons had just returned home on leave after 4 years' service on the battlefronts. This terrible tragedy happened just 1 day before Pesach, the festival of freedom. We've returned into the Whitechapel Road from Valence Road and continue our way through the main highway of the once-upon-a-time Jewish East End to Gardiners. For over 50 years, large advertising poster displays have been fronting this empty building site. Should there be someone beside you, nudging you with their elbow, then consider it as a tradition from the good old days. For here stood the Pavilion Theatre, the famous Yiddish playhouse dating back to the late 1800s. Telling your neighbor the next piece of action in the play, above the voice of the prompter, of course, was an essential part of the proceedings. And into the 1900s, stars from the Yiddish theatre, Morris Moskowitz, Morris Schwartz, the Adlers would bring thousands to the pavilion. Other stars, too, brought EastEnders to the pavilion. One such star, connected with the Yiddish theatre and boxing, was Froggy Hyams, one-time Southern Area middleweight champion of Great Britain. Froggy and Flo were married at the great synagogue, Duke's Place, in the 1930s.
I came from a from family. My parents were far more interested in me going to Cheder than they were to me going to school. I saw even from that time that working in a sweatshop was not for me. My father worked himself to a short life in the sweatshops. The Yiddish theatre, that was our playground, and one day the stage manager enlisted all us young boys into the choir for a play that was going on called the Pinteliyid. There was no mention of any wages, and we never got any wages. But we all used to get a free ticket here and there to give our parents a chance to see the shows.
It's not so long ago that next door to the pavilion was the missionary center, Hebrew Christian Testimony to Israel. One of the missionaries was a Stepney Jew. He converted to Christianity on his way to Japan, soon left his mission in Yokohama to return and spread the gospel in Whitechapel. There were at least 4 other missions in the East End in the 1980s. This, the last one, has now also given up the ghost. The Wizard of Oz poster was put up just before the Academy Drama School took over the building. The foundation school, a few doors along, was better known as the Davenant. Now it is a further education centre. Of its pre-war pupils of some 300, 98% were Jewish, and nearly all scholarship boys. It was established in 1680 by St. Mary's Whitechapel Church as a church school. The Reverend Ralph Davenant was the minister at the time. Some 70 years ago, on the opposite side of the road was Hyman Polsky. He considered himself primarily an artist, not so much a photographer. In more recent times, next door to the Royal Oak was Fell's, the salt beef restaurant. Over the past 50 years, publicans at the Royal Oak have been Morris Cowan, Isidore Isaacs, and Davis Levy. Did they, I wonder, ever walk down the alley beside the pub to visit here on the right Vine Court Schule? Its exterior was always austere, but Theodor Herzl campaigned for Zionism in Vine Court as well as the Great Assembly Hall. The door on the right, in days gone by, would have brought you into the Schule. In the 1950s, after the war, Vine Court was still an active community, but possibly for many of its congregants, its fame was linked to the eloquent rabbi storyteller, the Maggid Moshe Shmuel Rabinowitz. Hundreds would walk miles, even on a foggy Shabbat afternoon, to be thrilled by his dramatic sermons in Yiddish. Whilst Vine Court Schule was only a few yards back from the Whitechapel Road, no synagogue has ever had its frontage in the main road itself, and at no time has there been a Jewish communal building which could compare in grandeur with the new mosque in Whitechapel. But where today the mosque dominates the main road, here was the magnificent Rivoli of pre-war days. Like other East End cinemas, it became a synagogue for the High Holy Days, and at Hanukkah time, the annual celebration of the local Hebrew classes would sing out Ma'at Sur and the Hatikva before the Laurel and Hardy film show. But magnificent it was. For only a few coppers you would have a 3-hour program made up of 2 feature films, the news and cartoons, a variety show, and on this occasion a 1-hour musical, Second Hand Rose. In the dress suit and the grey top hat is Mr. Tripp, the Rivoli's manager, probably the only black man to hold such a responsible position in any of London's cinemas. Facing the Rivoli was Mazin, not just a bookshop but famous as publishers of Jewish music. Mazin's rightly foresaw its diminishing East End market, and by the 1950s had taken smaller premises. Next door was Fischerly, the farriers, and Adolf Cohen, the hairdresser, famous for having Vidal Sassoon as one of its apprentices. Where the commercial gas companies stood on the corner of Great Garden Street, here the tailors met. In the days of bitter struggles to improve working conditions in the sweatshops, the union's offices were in Great Garden Street, and even when the offices moved away, the tailors still gathered on this corner to compare wages and give the inside story why the governor went bankrupt. The tailors no longer meet on the corner of Great Garden Street. The gas company has gone, and even the street's name has changed. Now it is Great Toric Street. In the Morris Lederman House are the offices of the Federation of Synagogues, and in this building too is the Great Garden Street Shul. The synagogue is one of the 4 remaining in East London, struggling hard to maintain regular services. In days gone by, even when there were some 70 synagogues between the La Boheme and Gardiners, it was popular for weddings. There were 5 reception halls nearby. Its children's Hebrew classes were the largest in the area. Michael Goldman, for 25 years, was the senior administrator at the Federation's head office at the Morris Lederman House.
Morris Lederman's name has been sculptured into the structure of this building, but I would rather say that Moshe Lederman has been a very human, astute, communal leader in Anglo Jewry for nearly half a century. He made sure that our synagogues maintained their Orthodox traditions, as well as their solidarity with Israel. And I can tell you, from personal knowledge, it was no easy task to get the honorary officers of disappearing congregations to amalgamate and to combine their resources. This Moshe Lederman achieved without allowing the powerful personalities in other communal organizations to water down our status. He was the supreme East Ender. As president of the Federation, he spoke for the ordinary Jewish people of the East End. But he was realistic enough to realize that there was a South, a North, and a West End to London as well.
The Morris Kessler Hall is next door to the Federation offices. Its plain entrance might lead you to think this is just a communal hall. Here, Paul Levine runs the Kosher Luncheon Club, an eating house fast attracting customers from all over London.
I'm glad you said eating house. This is a place where you can really feel at home. Kosher we certainly are, but it's the atmosphere. Hamish quality food with atmosphere. I promise you, you'll get the same welcome for a cup of tea as for a 5-course meal. I grew up in Golders Green, but I'm often told about that special friendliness of East End folk, caring and helping each other. I see it when old East Enders bump into each other here, and the stories that they tell me. It's like one big happy family.
Paul Levine's Luncheon Club is opposite Evelyn House on the corner of Great Toric Street and Old Montague Street. And it is here that the old-timers would say, "Now you're talking. This is Taka, the real Yiddish East End." This large brick wall is in Old Montague Street, on the other side of Great Torick Street, immediately opposite Evelyn House. Where this brick wall stands, once upon a time, was the baker shop of Samuel Lieberman. In the early 1900s, the owner was Harris Yankelovich, the grandfather of former cabinet minister Lord Young. Sam Lieberman was the brother-in-law of Harris Yankelovich. Sam bought the shop. He soon became recognized as one of the top master bakers in the East End for black and rye bread. Sam was equally renowned for his sweet voice as a chazan. The jig of a stiebel was just around the corner in Dunk Street. Often after a hard day's work, he would simply join in the evening prayers, but on Shabbos and festivals, attired in his silk hat and frock coat, he would cross over the Whitechapel Road to Fieldgate Street to lead the services at the Astreicher Stiebel in Fieldgate Street. The love of shul music has passed on from Sam to his son Lionel Lee. Since his early teens, Lionel has been a choir master. He has composed many melodies for the synagogue.
Even in my army days, during the war, whenever a few of us could get together for religious service, it was a song, the shul melody, which moved us. When I was 6, I was in Cousin Bernstein's choir in Great Garden Street Shul. He conducted us on the bima as he sang as a Cousin. And I'm sure the Hasidic melodies I heard in the Jikava, Yesvacher, and the other Stieblach I used to attend influenced my music. You can hear it, feel it, in this melody I composed for the Adonalam and other choral pieces too. And here, Old Montague Street. Now it looks so small, so tiny, so narrow. When we were kids, that same street was a highway. Everything then was big. What memories.
This view of today's Old Montague Street, close to where Lionel Lee lived, will not revive any memories for him. But I'm sure he and so many others will never forget Esther and Annie, the bagel women at Bloom's Corner at the Brick Lane end of Old Montague Street. Nor would they forget their horrendous Yiddish curses should you pass them by without buying a bagel. Just beyond Esther and Annie was Simon Cohen's sweet shop. And on the left, across the street from the sweet shop, where you see the sunblinds, this was the herring shop of Mrs. Marks and her 2 daughters. The boys on the curb are facing Frostic Place, which today still leads you through to Hopetown Street. The shop in the background, in Old Montague Street, is one of the few remaining buildings from days gone by. This shop has some special significance for us. Sailing-Gold, the publisher and bookseller. Sailing-Gold was one of 4 Jewish bookshops in Old Montague Street in the 1930s. When one recalls that close by in Osborne Street was Golub, and just as close was Shapiro Valentine in Wentworth Street, then, by adding Mazin in the Whitechapel Road, there were 7 religious bookshops within 5 minutes walking distance of each other. Synagogues too abounded in and around Old Montague Street. Today on the left, where the Hopetown Salvation Army Hostel for Women is located, this was the entrance to the Chevra Shas Synagogue. Oddly enough, some attention has always been made to its wooden moulded doors. It seems they came from a Victorian music hall in Hoxton. The Chevra Shas was a vibrant Leibediker congregation. Its warmth and intimacy truly reflected the Stiebel from Boheme. The bulldozers demolished the shul in the 1970s. But Old Montague Street itself is still on the map. This cannot be said for one thoroughfare unique to the Jewish East End. Where the white car is parked, here were the steps which led you down into Black Line Yard, the famous alleyway of jewelry shops. In 1934, There were 23 businesses here. 11 were jewellerers. Segelov, Leighton, Feldman, Brilliant Stone, Schlossberg, Silver, Elgrod, Fishberg, Granite, Schumann, and Roshinsky. At the end of the 19th century, the only familiar name in Black Lion Yard itself was Evans the Cowkeepers. Not one jeweller was there. There was the pub, the Red Lion, and Thomas Newbury, the chimney sweep. Added later in Yiddish to meet the needs of the newcomers was Frisch von der Kuh. By the late 1970s, this familiar view of Black Lion Yard from Old Montague Street would have given way to this, with the new Salvation Army hostel in Old Montague Street spreading across Black Lion Yard. And where you see Steingo, the jeweller, today there is an extensive red brick building, the Whitechapel Technology Centre, stretching out along the Whitechapel Road. The entrance to Black Lion Yard was about where you see the street name Whitechapel Road. And for a majestic farewell to this fascinating parade of jewellers, what better than to bring back the event in the 1920s when King George V and Queen Mary were across the road from Black Lion Yard to visit the Whitechapel Bell Foundry. The Bell Foundry is on the left, and from Philgate Street we can see across to the Black Lion Yard part of the Whitechapel Road, now so completely transformed. Well, with all the changes you've seen, let me explain where you are. On the right is the Bell Foundry, and looking back east along the Whitechapel Road, there is the mosque. To complete our trip to Gardiners, we need to go in the opposite direction, passing the tall trees which, once upon a time, surrounded Whitechapel Church, St. Mary's. In the 1950s, the war-damaged steeple was still standing, and in the distance, the clock tower of Gardiners stands unscathed from the Blitz. Like so many of you, it was at Boris my own wedding photograph was taken.
To me, a bridal couple, when they came in, was like a prince and princess, because my love for my work could only see beauty in every one that came into my studio. Even when they were a little bit nervous, with a few very kind words, looking in their face, they warmed up towards me very quickly, and I got what I wanted, and that was that they should look their very best.
Close to the Boris studio on the corner of Adler Street was the engineer suppliers Buck and Hickman. Today, the Habib Bank is there. The bell tower of the rebuilt German church stands close to where Adler House used to be. Over the years, Adler House was a major centre for many of Anglo-Jewry's communal activities. We shall tell the story of Adler House in another program, but this view as we go back to the early 1900s simply confirms that the missionaries were very active in those days. The Yiddish banner is inviting immigrants to go to the church at 3 o'clock. The missionary is speaking from an outside pulpit looking across the Whitechapel Road where, in the 1920s and 30s, Joseph Suss had his photographic studio. And as we look at this Suss family portrait, we can recall that close by was Silverstein's restaurant and Joseph Perkoff's pub, the Nag's Head. We have reached the end of the Whitechapel Road. St. Mark's of London is on the corner of Osborne Street, leading into Brick Lane. On the left, the shop with the red awning, Minka Fashions, here begins Whitechapel High Street. Much post-war rebuilding has transformed the area, and now we can see just a fraction of the air raid devastation which ravaged so much of East London. Barney's fruit stall pinpoints a very special and possibly unique post office which our forebears from all over the East End put to good use. Feldman's post office was next door to the original Kosher Wine Company. Feldman was not just a Yiddish-speaking postmaster. Here, ship tickets were bought and currency arranged to bring over the Mishpucha, the family, from Europe. Feldman was, in effect, their own Minister for Information and Absorption. And it was across the road from Osborne Street, in the Whitechapel High Street, at the library and art gallery that some of those bewildered immigrants made a remarkable reputation for themselves. When you are next at Aldgate East Underground Station, pause for a moment and read the detail on the blue plaque by the entrance to the Whitechapel Library. Isaac Rosenberg, poet and painter, lived and studied here. At the age of 28 in April 1918, Rosenberg was killed on the Western Front whilst on night patrol. 3 biographies establishing his reputation as a major poet and gifted artist have been published. In the trenches, he wrote this poem as he desperately attempted to be transferred to Jabotinsky's Jewish Legion. Through these pale, cold days, what dark face burn out of 3,000 years, and their wild eyes yearn, while underneath their brows, like waifs, their spirits grope for the pools of Hebron again, for Lebanon's summer slope. For the many Jewish artists who grew up in the East End, the art gallery has always been special to them. And after 1901, when the gallery first opened, Jewish antiquities as well as paintings have been exhibited there. But whilst artists like Mark Gertler and David Bomberg have always been associated with the gallery, probably it was the annual J&F Bazaar which brought thousands of visitors to the gallery in the days before the war. In my trips to the East End, the traffic generally seems to flow quite smoothly past the gallery and library. Not so in the 1920s. Then, hay carts were parked in the middle of the high street. Cowkeepers and horse-drawn wagoners came to buy their fodder. It took an act of Parliament to force those hay carts to move. And so today there is no difficulty in seeing Bloom's, with its claim to be the most famous kosher restaurant in Great Britain. One of the few visible relics of the Jewish East End can be seen close to Bloom's. By the White Hart pub is the narrow Gunthorpe Street with City of London College sign above. On the other side of Gunthorpe Street is Albert's, the gents' outfitter. Above the doorway is this prominent Magen David designed by Arthur Schick, world famous for his brilliant illustrated Haggadah. In 1935, these were the editorial and printing offices of the only London Jewish daily newspaper to appear in English. After only a few months, it went bankrupt. This was the period when the trams trundled along the middle of the road, but 1 year later, in 1936, here the trams were brought to a standstill at Gardiners Corner. This was the beginning of the Battle of Cable Street, which in some ways Baron Moss touched upon at the beginning of this program. But the struggle against Mosley we shall tell another day, for now we have reached Gardiners, the gents and military outfitters which stood at the crossroads of 5 main thoroughfares in East London: Whitechapel High Street, Commercial Road, Lemon Street, Aldgate High Street, and Commercial Street, which leads to Liverpool Street Station. Gardiners survived the Blitz on London. But in May 1972, 25 years after the war ended, Gardiners was destroyed by fire. Today's new building, where Gardiners stood, clearly shows that the East End is very much alive, and so it should be. The Jewish East End? Well, what do you think?